The wind came before the snow. It always did in Wyoming. It came sliding down off the Absaroka Range like something alive, like something that had decided after long consideration that it did not care for the town of Coldwater Ridge and everything in it. It found the gaps between the cabin walls. It tested the hinges on the shutters. It moved through the lodgepole pines at the edge of town. With a sound like a congregation murmuring prayers, low, continuous, and without mercy, Eleanor Voss heard it the way she heard most things, quietly, from the inside. She was standing on the porch of the cabin her husband had built with his own hands, a structure of notched pine and river stone that had stood for 11 years and would not stand much longer if the winter that was coming proved to be the winter Henry had always said was coming. She held a canvas bag in her left hand. It was not a large bag. She had not packed much because she had not needed to. Everything that mattered, everything that would keep her alive, was already waiting for her in the forest. At her side, pressed against her left leg with the quiet certainty of an animal that had long ago decided where it belonged, stood Shepherd. He was a German shepherd of uncommon size and uncommon stillness, his coat the color of a storm cloud, with amber threading through it, his eyes a deep and serious amber that caught the thin December light and held it. He was not looking at Eleanor. He was looking at the men. There were 7 of them on the path that led from the main road to her porch. Warren Caldwell stood at the front. He was 55 years old and looked in the particular way of men who have spent decades being agreed with, like a man who had never once questioned the accuracy of his own judgment. He wore a good coat, dark wool, the kind that said he had not come here on a whim. He had come here with the full weight of Coldwater Ridge behind him, and he wanted Eleanor to feel that weight. She felt it. She simply did not buckle under it. Behind Warren stood the others 3 members of the town council, a man named Guthrie who ran the feed store, and 2 men Eleanor did not know well enough to name but recognized well enough to understand. They were the kind of men who showed up for things like this, not because they felt strongly, because they did not want to be the ones who stayed home. Cecily Hargrove was not among them. Eleanor had not expected her to be. The silence lasted a long time. That was the thing. People who had never seen a forced departure did not understand how much of it was silence. The cold filled the space between the people standing there, and the wind moved through the pines, and nobody said anything for what felt like minutes, because nobody needed to. The decision had been made 3 days ago in a room Eleanor had not been invited to. The men on her path were not here to explain. They were here to witness. Warren finally spoke. His voice was measured and steady, and entirely without apology. The council has made its position clear, Eleanor. We've a hard season ahead. Every person in Coldwater Ridge will need to carry their weight, and the council has determined. He paused, as men do when they are reciting something they have rehearsed. The council has determined that your continued presence is a drain on resources and a disruption to the order of this community. Eleanor said nothing. Warren continued, and his voice tightened slightly, the way a man's voice tightens when silence from the person he is addressing makes him feel, despite his best efforts, uncertain. You've spent the better part of 6 months wandering those woods, not farming, not contributing to the winter stores, not participating in the cooperative efforts that this town depends on. He glanced at the men behind him as if checking that they were still there. They were. We are not without compassion. The road south remains passable for another day or two at most. There are settlements in... I know where the road goes, Eleanor said. It was not a loud statement. It was not defiant in any theatrical way. It was simply a fact delivered in the tone of a woman who was finished listening to a man explain things she already understood. Warren closed his mouth. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. Then she looked one by one at the men behind him. She did this slowly, and without expression, the way a person looks at something they want to remember accurately. Then she looked back at Warren. When the real storm comes, she said, don't come out into the woods looking for me. Several of the men behind Warren exchanged glances. One of them, the younger one she didn't know well, made a face that was halfway between amusement and something that wanted to be pity. Warren's expression did not change. He had already categorized what Eleanor had just said, another piece of evidence supporting the council's conclusion. A woman undone by grief. A woman who had been communing with a dead oak tree for 6 months. A woman who, when given the opportunity for a dignified departure, chose instead to issue cryptic pronouncements about storms. He nodded once. He turned. The men followed him down the path, pulling their coats tighter against the wind, and did not look back. Eleanor watched them go. Then she picked up the bag, said one quiet word to Shepard, a word no one else was close enough to hear, and stepped off the porch into the snow. She did not look back at the cabin. She had said goodbye to it 3 days ago when she first understood what was coming, and she had said it in the way of a person who understands that a building is not the same thing as a home, that a home is something you carry or something you build. And she had for 6 months been building. She walked toward the trees. Henry Voss had been a trapper and a wilderness scout for the better part of his adult life before he settled in Coldwater Ridge, and the thing that people who had known him remembered most, the thing they said at his grave, and in the weeks afterward in that reflexive way people speak about the dead, when they are still close enough to feel the shape of the absence, was that he had known how to read things. He had known how to read weather and terrain and the behavior of animals in ways that most men learn to approximate. And Henry seemed to have been born understanding. What people said less often because it was harder to put into words was that Henry had also known how to read time. Not the time on a clock, but the longer kind, the time that moves through landscapes and climates, and the slow turning of systems so large that most people could not perceive them at all. He had spent enough winters in the high country to understand that they were not the same from decade to decade, that something was shifting in the patterns, that the cold seasons were getting longer and harder, in a way that the settlers who had come to Wyoming in the last 20 years had not yet been tested by. He had talked about this with Eleanor over the years. She had listened in the way she listened to everything Henry said, completely without interrupting, storing the information in that quiet interior place where she kept the things that mattered. He had talked about the winter of 1864, which had killed more livestock across the territory than anyone had records for. He had talked about a trapper he'd known in his 20s, a man named Colson, who had survived 6 days in a blizzard by burrowing into the base of an old-growth tree. He had talked in the abstract, and then in increasingly specific terms about what a person would need, what any person would need. Not just a woodsman, not just someone like him to survive a true catastrophe winter. Eleanor had listened. She had not known in those early years that he was not speaking abstractly. He had found the tree in 1872. He had been 31 years old, working a survey route through the old-growth section of the forest northeast of what would become Coldwater Ridge, when a late-season storm had come in faster than he expected. He had been caught in it, a rarity for him, and in the deteriorating visibility he had made his way upslope through timber, so old and dense that it reduced the wind to a whisper. And then, in a natural clearing on the leeward side of a ridge, he had found the oak. It was not a tree that made sense in that place in that way. Oaks of that size belong to older, wetter climates, to centuries of growth undisturbed by axe or fire. This one had survived because of the ridge. The geology of that particular slope had created a natural windbreak that protected the tree from the burning dryness that took so much else, and it had grown for what Henry estimated based on its circumference and bark depth was somewhere between 300 and 400 years. Its trunk was wider than a man could span with both arms. Its root system had over those centuries created a raised platform of earth around its base that functioned like the hull of a ship, and at the leeward side of that platform, where the largest root structures had grown together and then apart again over time, there was a hollow. Henry had crawled into it. He had spent the night there, pressed against the dog he had. Then that was another shepherd. The first one, the grandfather of the animal that now walked beside Eleanor, in a space that was dark and close and smelled of heartwood and damp earth. And he had been warm, not comfortable, not warm in any way that he would have called pleasant under normal circumstances, but alive warm, survivably warm in conditions that he calculated would have been dangerous in the open. He had lain there through the night, listening to the storm, and he had thought about Colson. He had thought about what this space was, what it could become if someone spent the time. He had gone back the following spring, and the spring after that, over the years quietly and without telling anyone, not because he was secretive by nature, but because he understood that the kind of preparation he was contemplating was the kind that, if spoken of in public, invites the particular species of mockery that communities reserve for people who take the future seriously. He had worked. He had widened the hollow where the wood allowed it. He had laid down a floor of flat stones to lift the sleeping surface off the damp earth. He had studied the way the chimney-like column of the tree's upper cavity drew air, and he had spent 2 summers building a fire ring of fitted stones in the center of the floor with a channel carved into the wood above it, carved slowly, carefully with instruments designed not to damage the living tissue of the tree, that directed smoke upward and out through a gap in the bark near the first major fork, 30 feet up, invisible from the ground. He had built shelves from weathered planks pressed into the wood's natural crevices. He had carried water from the spring 100 yards north trip by trip in sealed clay vessels. He had stored dry wood under oilcloth braces he had fitted to the outer root arches. He had, over 14 years of patient and solitary effort, turned a natural hollow in an ancient tree into something that could hold people alive through the worst winter the territory could produce. He had not told Eleanor about any of this until the autumn of 1886, when he understood that he was dying, and that the winter she would face alone was the winter he had been preparing for. She had sat beside his bed in the amber light of the oil lamp, and he had talked for a long time. He was not a man who had ever talked easily, but he talked that night with the focused precision of someone transmitting something urgent. Not because he was afraid she wouldn't remember, but because he knew there would be questions, and he might not be there to answer them, and so he answered them in advance, answered them. He described the tree. He described the approach through the timber, the landmarks that would guide her in poor visibility, the specific root arch under which the entrance was set. He described the fire ring and the smoke channel, and where the kindling cache was stored. He described the inventory he had built up over the years, the smoked venison wrapped in wax cloth, the dried corn and beans in the sealed clay pots, the parched grain, the dried berries, the medicinal herbs bundled and hung from the shelf brackets. He described the spring and how to find it if the surface froze over. He described where he had stored the extra blankets, the oilcloth, the secondary fire-starting kit, in case the primary was lost. He talked for nearly 2 hours. Then he reached under the edge of his mattress and retrieved a notebook. It was a plain thing, the kind surveyors used, filled with his precise and economical handwriting from the first page to the last, with diagrams worked into the margins and a rough map of the approach route drawn on the inside front cover. "It's all in here," he said. "Everything I told you and more. The things I'll think of after I'm asleep." He paused. "Read it in order. The front pages first." Eleanor took the notebook. She held it with both hands. "Henry," she said. "I know," he said. That was all they said about it. He died 6 weeks later in October of 1886. In the bed he had built in the cabin he had built in the town he had chosen in the territory he had known better than almost anyone alive. He died without drama, without final words that anyone outside the room would have found remarkable in the particular quiet of a man who had over a lifetime made his peace with the terms of being human. He had spent his last months not in the helpless surrender that illness so often demands, but in the concentrated labor of a man ensuring that what he had started would be completed, coming back from the hollow exhausted beyond what she had understood, until later, working past the point his body could afford, finishing the east wall insulation, and the secondary water storage, and the firewood cache on the north root arch, because he had calculated with the same precision he brought to everything that Eleanor would not have time to do all of it herself. The death that looked like defeat was not defeat. Eleanor understood this only after reading the notebook. She buried him on the hill east of town, beside the 3 people before him who had been buried there. And she stood at the grave for a long time, in the November cold. And then she walked home, and she read the notebook. She read it for 3 nights straight. Then she got up before dawn on the 4th morning, packed the tools she would need into a canvas sack, and walked into the woods. What the people of Coldwater Ridge saw over the following 6 months was a widow who had lost her mind to grief. This was not an unreasonable interpretation, given what they could observe. Eleanor Voss left her cabin every morning before most people were awake, carrying tools and materials, an axe, a hand shovel, coils of rope, bundles of dried material, sealed containers of various kinds, and returned at dusk, sometimes after dark, with mud on her boots and her hands, and a look on her face that was not the look of a woman in distress. It was, people noted with some unease, the look of a woman who had somewhere to be. Cecily Hargrove was the primary architect of the narrative that developed around Eleanor's behavior. Cecily was 50 years old and had, over the course of her tenure as the wife of Coldwater Ridge's most prosperous merchant, become the person through whom most of the town's social information passed. She was not cruel in her intentions. She was simply a person for whom the world only fully made sense when it could be explained. And Eleanor Voss had become difficult to explain. "Saw her again this morning," Cecily said to the women gathered at the dry goods counter on a Tuesday in December. "Before first light, going toward those old woods with that enormous dog and a sack big enough to carry a body." She shook her head, talking to herself. "She lost Henry only 2 months ago," said one of the women, a younger woman named Prudence, a school teacher's wife who had arrived in Coldwater Ridge only the previous spring and had not yet learned to confuse the town's consensus for truth. Her tone carried the mild resistance of someone who had not yet fully conceded the argument. "I know what she lost," Cecily said. "I know grief. This isn't grief. Grief is when you cry in church and you can't eat and your friends sit with you. This is something else." She set down the cloth she was examining. "She's out there in that forest talking to that dead tree. The same tree every day. You ask me, her mind's gone to the same place Henry went." In the saloon, the men had their own version. A dead oak with a hollow trunk. The widow carrying rocks to it, carrying wood to it, digging around the base of it, like she was trying to plant it or resurrect it. And this drew particular laughter move into it. "Maybe she's building a home for the squirrels," said a man named Orland who worked the tannery and who found this very funny. "She'd be better company for the squirrels than for us," said another. Warren Caldwell heard these conversations. He also, on one occasion in November, encountered Eleanor himself on the edge of the eastern forest. She was dragging a heavy bundle of something he could not determine exactly what toward the trees. He had called to her because he was a man who felt that the town's welfare was his particular responsibility and because he had been developing for some weeks. The specific kind of concern that leaders develop when someone in their community behaves in a way that falls outside the established categories. "Eleanor," he had said, stepping toward her, "this isn't right. A woman alone shouldn't be spending her days wandering out there. Henry's been gone 2 months. There are people in town who could use your help. The church is short 2 hands for the winter store's preparation, and Nora Aldrich has 3 children and a husband laid up with fever." Eleanor had stopped walking. She had looked at him. Not through him, which might have been easier to categorize, but directly at him with a kind of clear attention that was worse somehow than any response he had anticipated. She said nothing. She turned and continued walking toward the trees. Warren stood on the path and watched her go and felt for the first time in the process that would end on Eleanor's porch in December the particular discomfort of a man who has just realized that the person he intended to help has not experienced his offer as help. He filed that feeling away in the place where men like Warren Caldwell store the things they prefer not to examine. What Eleanor was doing in those 6 months was this. She was reading Henry's notebook, and she was doing what it said. The hollow was larger than she had expected, larger than Henry's descriptions had quite prepared her for, and the basic structure was more complete than she had dared hope. He had built well. The fire ring was perfectly constructed, the smoke channel genuinely functional, the flat stone floor dry and solid, the existing shelves sturdy and level. But Henry had built the hollow for 2, perhaps 3 people at the outer limit, himself and Eleanor a refuge for a couple designed with the intimate scale of a man who had not yet imagined that the catastrophe he was preparing for might require more. Eleanor looked at the space, and understood immediately what it needed to become. She built it for 15. This required time and physical effort of a kind that tested her in ways she had not expected. She was not a weak woman. She had lived in Wyoming for 11 years and had never confused comfort with necessity. But she had also not spent her adult life doing the specific kind of sustained manual labor that the expansion required. Her hands blistered and then calloused. Her back ached at the end of the days in a way that was not temporary pain but structural, the kind that announced it was settling in for the season. She widened the northern wall by 3 feet, packing the new section with compressed moss and clay for insulation. She added 6 new shelf brackets. She installed the secondary water storage Henry had left as framing, only carrying the sealed clay vessels herself, trip by trip from the spring. She extended the firewood cache under the south root arch to match the one Henry had built under the north. There was one evening in late January, about 6 weeks into the work, when she sat against the outer root arch of the sentinel oak as the last light went out of the sky, and she came as close as she had come since reading Henry's notebook to simply stopping. She was cold. She was exhausted in a way that went past muscle and into something deeper. The expanded hollow behind her was half finished. The new insulating layer on the northern wall was complete. But the additional shelf brackets were still raw wood, and the secondary water storage she had planned had not yet been installed, and she was very aware in the gathering dark of everything that was not yet done, and of the size of the task she had set herself, and of the fact that there was no one else. She sat there for a long time. Shepard settled against her left side, solid and warm. He pressed his weight into her ribs in a specific way that he had not leaning exactly, but making himself present in a way that communicated something more than company. He put his head on her left knee and looked out at the dark trees without concern. Eleanor put her right hand on his back and felt his breathing. She thought about Henry. She thought about him in the particular way she allowed herself in private, which was fully not the managed version of grief she wore in town, which was the absence of visible grief, rather than its absence, but the actual thing. She thought about the sound of his voice, the way he had handed her the notebook with both hands as if it were fragile. The 14 years he had spent coming back to this tree season after season, turning a hollow in a root structure into something that could hold and warm and keep. She thought about the final months, about the exhaustion she had misread as illness, about what she now understood he had been doing in the hours she thought he was resting. She thought about what it would mean to stop. Shepard shifted. He lifted his head from her knee and turned and looked at her face directly with the disconcerting focus that this particular animal had always brought to the moments when Eleanor's internal state diverged from her external presentation. He held the look for a moment. Then he stood up, turned to face the hollow and looked back at her. It was not a complicated communication, but it was sufficient. Eleanor got up. She went back inside and worked by lantern light for another hour. And then she walked home in the dark. And she came back before dawn the next morning. She came back every morning after that. By the time the council made its decision in December of 1887, Eleanor had been inside Sentinel Oak more times than she could count. She knew every timber of it, every stone of the floor, every joint of the shelf brackets. She knew how long the wood took to catch from different starting materials. How many minutes the hollow took to warm to livable temperature from dead cold. How the smoke behaved in different wind conditions. The way it thickened and pulled back. If the wind shifted from the northwest and the adjustment to the draft channel, that corrected for it. She knew that the food stores as of 3 days before the council meeting were sufficient to sustain 14 people for 22 days on reduced rations. She knew that the water between the spring and the secondary storage was adequate. She knew that the firewood cache stacked under the root arch overhangs on both sides of the entrance would last longer than the food. She had not told anyone any of this. She had considered it. She had stood in the town square on a dry afternoon in October, watching the men stacking wood against the sides of their cabins and watching the women laying in their kitchen stores. And she had thought about walking up to Warren Caldwell and saying, "I need to show you something. I need to show you what Henry built, and what I've finished and why it matters and why you need to know about it before the real winter comes." She had not done it, because she had looked at Warren's face and known what he would do with that information, and she had looked at the faces around him and known what they would do with it, and she had looked at the sky and looked at the trees and read in both of them the approach of something that was not going to care about what was socially acceptable or what Warren Caldwell did or did not believe. So she kept working, and she kept quiet. And on a Tuesday morning in December of 1887, she stood on her porch with her canvas bag and her dog and 7 men who had decided she was the problem. The walk through the forest was not easy. The storm was not yet at its full strength that would come, but it was building, and what was building communicated to anyone paying attention the shape of what it intended to become. The wind that had been a whisper in the pines when the men stood on Eleanor's path was a sustained pressure now cold enough to make her eyes water strong enough that she was conscious of her center of gravity in a way she normally was not. She walked with her head down and slightly angled her coat pulled close her bag in her left hand. Shepard moved ahead of her and then back, reading the terrain through the deteriorating visibility, finding the path through the drifts with the confident efficiency of an animal for whom this particular forest had no mysteries. Eleanor navigated by memory and by feel. She had made this walk more times than she could count, in all kinds of light and weather, and the internal map was complete. The double-trunk birch that marked the turn north, the low limestone outcrop that told her she was a third of the way, the sudden deepening of the timber that announced the approach of the old-growth section, where the trees grew so large and close that they became their own weather system. She was cold. The cold was not casual. It was working at her, finding the gaps in her coat and her gloves and the scarf she had wound around the lower half of her face, sending its thin, precise messages into her joints. But she was moving, and movement was the enemy of the cold's primary ambition, and so she moved. She thought about Henry. She thought about the fact that he had made this walk in every season over 14 years, often alone, often carrying things heavier than what she carried now. She thought about the afternoons when he had come home late, when she had asked where he had been, and he had said, with the particular easy vagueness of a man who was not lying so much as postponing, that he had been checking a survey line that he had been tracking, that he had wanted to look at the old growth before the light went. She had not pressed him. She had known that Henry had parts of himself that were his to keep, and she had trusted that what he kept from her was not absence but storage things held in reserve for the right time. The right time had been October of 1886. She had been angry briefly in the weeks after he died, angry in the specific way of a person who has just discovered they have been protected from information. She had sat with the notebook on her third reading and thought, "You could have told me. You could have told me years ago. We could have built this together." And then she had understood why he hadn't. Because if she had known, if she had been part of it from the beginning, the town would have known too. The questions would have been asked in public, and the answers would have filtered through the mechanisms by which Coldwater Ridge processed and distributed information, which meant through Cecily Hargrove, and what came out of that process would not have been understanding. It would have been the exact conversation Warren Caldwell had been having for the past 6 months. The one about the widow and the tree, and the question of whether grief had made her dangerous. Henry had kept the secret so that the preparation could be completed. Eleanor had understood this on the third reading, and the anger had resolved into something else. Not peace, exactly. Something more durable than peace. The kind of clear-eyed comprehension that comes from fully understanding another person's choices and finding them on reflection correct. She was still thinking about this when she heard the sound. It was not the sound of the wind which she had learned to separate into its component parts. The high note of it in the upper branches, the lower register of it against the ground. Cover the variable middle tones that changed with the density of the timber. This was a different sound. It came from somewhere to her left and above, and it was the sound of mass in motion. She had 1 second to understand what it was. Then the small cornice of snow no more than 6 feet wide accumulated on the leeward side of the limestone ridge above the tree line to her left let go. It was not a large slide. In the full taxonomy of avalanche events, it would have been classified as minor. The kind of thing that happens on slopes all across the high country every winter, and is noted by no one because it injures no one because no one is there. But Eleanor was there, and she was in the path of it. And the force of 6 feet of compacted snow traveling 30 yards down a 30-degree slope at speed is not a thing that responds to the scale you assign it. It hit her from the left side and the back simultaneously. She went down hard, the bag flying from her hand, her right knee driving into the frozen ground under the snow. And then the weight of it was on top of her, and she was in the dark. The cold was immediate and total. The weight was not crushing. She could breathe in shallow sips, but she could not move her left arm, which was pinned under the main body of the slide, and her right arm, which was free, was not enough by itself to shift the mass above her. She was pressed face down into the snow, her head turned sideways, and she could see a narrow slant of gray light above her right shoulder that told her she was not completely buried. She did not panic. She took stock. Left arm pinned, not broken, she could feel it, which meant the circulation was intact. Right arm free. Legs unclear, she could feel her right foot but not her left, which was the one that had gone under the worst of the slide. Head uninjured. Breathing shallow but functional. She heard Shepard. He was above her and to the right, and the sound he made, she had heard it only twice in their years together. A rapid, focused, escalating excavation of sound and effort that was nothing like his normal voice told her everything she needed to know about the assessment he had made of the situation. He was digging. He was digging with the concentrated ferocity of an animal that has reduced the world to a single task. She could feel the vibration of it through the snow. She did not call out to him. He knew where she was. Calling would cost her air. She waited. 4 minutes. She counted them in the way her father had taught her to count time in stressful situations, by the slow doubling of numbers in her head. 1, 2, 4, 8, 16. A method that had the advantage of requiring just enough cognitive engagement to prevent the kind of spiral that makes 4 minutes feel like 40. The weight on her left side shifted. Then Shepard's muzzle was at her right ear, his breath warm and purposeful, and then his teeth were gentle and definite on the collar of her coat, and she understood what he was doing and helped as much as she could, driving with her right arm and her right knee and whatever portion of her left leg she could bring to bear, and together they moved her free of the slide's main mass, and she was on the surface again, and the gray light of the forest was around her. She lay still for 30 seconds, just breathing, taking inventory. Her left arm was bruised to the shoulder but intact. Her left foot ached with the specific depth of cold that told her it had been packed in snow long enough to need warming. Her right knee was going to be remarkable in its color by tomorrow. Everything else was present. Shepard stood over her, looking down, his expression containing the particular quality that dogs wear when they have just done something necessary and are waiting to see whether it has been sufficient. Eleanor reached up and put her hand on his jaw. "Good boy," she said. Her voice was steady. It was the voice of a woman who has survived something and is already past it, already moving on to the next thing, because the next thing was still ahead of her and still needed doing. She found her bag. She got up. She walked the last quarter mile to the Sentinel Oak. The hollow was exactly as she had left it. She stood inside it for a moment after ducking through the entrance just inside the threshold, while her eyes adjusted from the gray chaos of the storm outside to the dark, still interior. The wind reduced to a sound like the memory of wind present audible, but on the other side of something solid. Something old and patient and indifferent to its ambitions. She found the fire kit by feel. She had placed it in the same spot every time she left, for exactly this reason: for the arrival, wet and cold and possibly hurt, for the need to make fire without the luxury of searching. The flint was there, the steel, the cedar tinder she kept in a sealed tin. Her hands were cold enough that the first 3 strikes produced nothing useful, but the 4th caught, and she fed it with the deliberate care of someone for whom fire was not comfort, but infrastructure. The kindling was dry. The first small log she added, split pine seasoned since the previous spring, caught within a minute of the kindling taking. Within 15 minutes, there was a fire that meant something, that created a circle of warmth extending 6 feet in all directions, and that sent its thin, intelligent smoke up through the carved channel in the heartwood and out through the hidden gap 30 feet above. Eleanor peeled off her outer coat and her wet gloves and hung them on the bracket pegs she had installed specifically for this purpose. She unrolled the sleep mat and the wool blankets from their oilcloth wrapping and spread them on the flat stone floor on the fire's east side. She retrieved the first clay pot, the one marked with 2 horizontal scratches, which meant dried venison, and set a small amount to warm in the tin camp pan she kept on the fire ring's low shelf. She moved through each task with the economy of someone who has rehearsed this particular sequence enough times to have removed all excess from it. No motion wasted, no step repeated. Everything placed where it needed to be in the order it needed to be placed. This was the thing the people of Coldwater Ridge had never understood about Eleanor Voss. and would not understand until it was demonstrated to them in the most unambiguous possible terms. They had looked at her quiet and seen vacancy. They had looked at her solitude and seen damage. They had looked at her refusal to explain herself and seen a mind that had lost its connection to the normal world. What they had not seen, what they were constitutionally by virtue of the particular blindnesses that comfortable communities develop about people who do not behave the way comfortable communities expect. What they had not been able to see was competence. Sustained, deliberate, methodically acquired competence applied in service of a clear and rational purpose that simply operated on a timescale longer than the one they used to measure worth. Eleanor sat down beside the fire. Shepard settled against her left side. The storm moved through the forest outside with increasing confidence, and the hollow was warm. She reached into her bag and retrieved the notebook. She did not open it. She had not needed to open it in 3 months, having memorized its contents well before the first frost. She held it in both hands in her lap in the firelight, the way she had held it the first time Henry had given it to her, with both hands as if it were a living thing. She thought about what he had written on the final page in the different handwriting of a man who was very tired. The letters less precise than his usual. The sentences shorter. She did not need to read it. She knew every word. If they come to you in the storm, let them in. Not because they deserve it, because that is the difference between what we build and what they fear. What we build is for anyone who needs it. That is the only instruction that matters. Outside, the wind gathered itself for what it was about to do to Coldwater Ridge. Inside the Sentinel Oak, Eleanor Voss fed her fire and waited. The storm arrived at full strength sometime in the deep hours of that first night, and it arrived without the incremental courtesy of a thing that is still deciding. It came as a commitment. The wind that had been building since morning became in the space of an hour, something that had no useful comparison in ordinary experience. It was not wind in the way that December in Wyoming normally produced wind, the sharp directional cold that found your face and moved on. This was pressure, sustained omnidirectional structural pressure that pushed against every vertical surface in Coldwater Ridge simultaneously, as if the atmosphere itself had decided to test the integrity of everything human hands had constructed in this valley, and had allocated the night for the purpose. The snow came with it. Not falling, the word falling implied gravity, implied a direction, implied some cooperation between the sky and the ground below. This snow moved sideways upward in spiraling columns that reversed themselves without warning. It found the gaps between the logs of every cabin wall. It packed itself into the spaces around every doorframe and window shutter. It accumulated not in drifts which were manageable, which were the ordinary math of snow and wind that experienced Wyoming settlers had long since learned to account for, but in walls. Solid, consolidated walls of white that rose against the leeward sides of buildings with the purposeful geometry of something being constructed rather than deposited. Inside the hollow of the Sentinel Oak, Eleanor felt none of this. She heard it. The storm's voice was present even here, filtered through 3 feet of ancient heartwood into something low and continuous like the sound of a river heard from the far bank. It was audible. It was not threatening. The tree that had stood in this particular fold of land for somewhere between 300 and 400 years had in the course of that tenure survived things that made this storm a data point rather than an aberration. And the hollow at its heart communicated this through the simple quality of its stillness. The fire had been burning for 6 hours. The hollow had reached a temperature that, while not warm in any domestic sense, was warm in the sense that mattered, warm enough to sustain life. Warm enough to keep the cold from doing its primary work. Warm enough that the blankets on the stone floor constituted genuine shelter rather than gesture. Eleanor slept in intervals, the way she had learned to sleep in uncertain conditions, not fully present, occupying that middle ground where the body recovers what it needs, while the mind maintains a fraction of its watchfulness. She had banked the fire before her first sleep interval in the manner Henry's notebook prescribed: 2 heavy logs crossed at the center, packed earth pushed against their bases on the windward side, and it had held through the night and into the gray non-dawn of the storm's second day. Shepard slept with his back against her legs, generating a warmth of his own that was not negligible. Eleanor was aware of this even in sleep, aware of the weight and the heat of him, the slow rise and fall of his ribs. He was the most reliable thing in her world, and she knew it. And it was the kind of knowledge that does not require regular articulation. To remain present, she lay in the dark and listened to the storm and thought about Coldwater Ridge. She thought about the knotted pine structure of the town's main storage building, the one that held the collective winter provisions, the smoked meats and dried vegetables and sacked grain that the community had spent October preparing. She had spent enough years in Wyoming to know what that building could bear and what it could not, and what she was hearing through 3 feet of heartwood told her that the night's conditions would be testing the edge of the building's tolerance and possibly exceeding it. She thought about the Aldrich family, Nora and Edmund, and their 3 children, the youngest of whom had turned 2 in October. Their cabin was on the north side of the main road, which meant the windward face of their structure was taking the full uncorrected force of a storm that had decided to come primarily from the northwest. Edmund Aldrich was a competent man. He had built a competent cabin. Competent was not the same as sufficient. She thought about Cornelius Fenwick, who was 73 years old and lived alone at the east end of town, and whose chimney she had noticed on her last visit to town 3 weeks ago was drawing poorly. A problem that was an inconvenience in a normal winter, and a danger in this one, because a poorly drawing chimney meant smoke backing into the living space. And smoke backing into the living space of a man who was old and already living at the edge of what his lungs could do was a problem with a clear and proximate conclusion. She thought about all of this with the specific quality of concern that belongs to someone who is prepared for a situation and is now in the position of waiting for the situation to demonstrate why the preparation was necessary. She did not feel satisfaction. She did not feel vindicated. She felt, if she examined it honestly, the particular loneliness of having been right about something that she would have given a great deal to have been wrong about. In Coldwater Ridge, the second day of the storm began badly and declined from there. The first sign was the sound. People who had lived in Wyoming for years, who knew what a hard winter sounded like, who had experienced the ordinary severity of mountain weather, reported afterward that the sound of the second morning was different in a way they could not entirely articulate. It was not louder exactly. It was more insistent. It had the quality of something that had moved past the preliminary stages of what it intended to do and had arrived at the main business. Warren Caldwell was awake before dawn, which was not unusual for him. He was a man of regular habits, and the storm had not changed that. He dressed by the light of the lamp and went to the window and looked out. and could not see the building across the road, which was 40 feet away. He stood at the window for a moment processing this information. Then he heard the first of the sounds that would, over the next 6 hours, constitute the score of the community's unraveling. It was a crack, then a pause, then a sustained groaning of stressed timber that seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the town itself had decided to speak. The roof of Warren's attached storage room, a lean-to structure he had added to the main building 3 years ago, built with green wood, because the season's supply had been low that season, and he had intended to reinforce it the following spring, and had not shed its accumulated snow load in a single catastrophic exhalation. The lean-to did not collapse, but the sound of its roof flexing and the snow sliding free was sufficient to bring Warren to his back door in his coat and boots. And what he saw when he opened it was a wall of white where his back path had been chest-high, solid, and still growing. He stood in the doorway and felt the storm push against his chest with a force that was almost proprietary. He thought about Eleanor Voss. He thought about what she had said on the porch. He filed the thought the same way he always filed thoughts that were inconvenient to the positions he had already established, which was quickly and into a compartment he rarely revisited. Then he went inside and put more wood on his fire and told himself that the situation was manageable. Across town, the situation was not manageable. The main storage building, the one that held the collective winter provisions, had been showing stress in its roof beams since the previous afternoon, visible to anyone who had looked up and known what they were seeing. By mid-morning of the second day, it failed. Not a partial failure, not a damaged section. A full collapse of the central roof structure. The heavy pine beams driving downward into the stored goods below, crushing the sealed containers and the dry stack provisions, and the smoked meats in their waxcloth wrappings, mixing everything together under 600 pounds of wet snow and broken timber. Samuel Briggs heard it from his forge, which was 30 yards away, and he knew what it was before he went outside to confirm it. He stood in the driving snow looking at the caved roof of the storage building, and he did not say anything for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back inside and sat down on his work stool with his big hands between his knees, and thought with the methodical clarity that was his particular nature about what this meant. It meant that Coldwater Ridge's collective food supply was gone. Not depleted, not compromised. Gone. He sat with that for a while. Then he thought about Eleanor Voss. The Aldrich cabin did not collapse, but by mid-afternoon of the second day, it had become clear that it was not going to be a reliable structure for much longer. Edmund Aldrich had done everything a man could reasonably do. He had shored up the south wall with the spare timber from the woodpile. He had redistributed the interior weight. He had kept the roof clear until the wind made it too dangerous to continue. But the north wall had developed a lean that was outside the range of what he was willing to call acceptable, and the two youngest children were crying in the sustained, exhausted way of children who have been frightened long enough that they have lost the energy for the acute expression of it. Nora Aldrich was not a woman who expressed fear outwardly. She expressed it inwardly, and then she converted it into action. She was the one who suggested, when the north wall lean became visible in the afternoon, that they needed to think about where else they could go. Edmund did not immediately agree. Edmund suggested they wait another few hours and see how the wall developed. Nora pointed out in the calm and final tone she reserved for these moments that the time to move was before the necessity was absolute, not after. They argued about this for 20 minutes. Then a sound came from the north wall. not a crack, not a groan, but a kind of deep dents, settling the sound of mass redistributing, and the argument was over. They wrapped the children in everything they had that could be wrapped around children. They put on every layer they owned. They opened the door and discovered that the front drift had reached the top hinge, and they would have to go through the window instead. And they went through the window instead. Edmund first, then Nora, handing the children through, then Nora. They made it to the blacksmith's forge, which was the only structure in town, with a fully stone roof, in 6 minutes, that Edmund Aldrich would later describe as the longest 6 minutes of his adult life. He would describe the experience of moving through the storm, with his youngest child pressed against his chest, under his coat, being able to see perhaps 10 feet in any direction, the wind working against every step, as the experience that made everything else in his life look manageable by comparison. At the forge, they found Samuel Briggs and 3 other people who had arrived by different paths and for different reasons, and with the same result: the town was failing and the forge was the only solid thing left. Warren arrived an hour later. He did not arrive with authority or with a plan. He arrived with snow on his coat and a look on his face that Samuel Briggs recognized but had never expected to see there. The look of a man who has lost the organizing principle by which he has been navigating the world. He stood by the forge's central furnace, warming his hands, and did not speak for a while. Then Samuel told him about the storage building. Warren listened. He processed the information. He was a man who was very good under normal circumstances at processing information and producing a response that had the quality of a decision. Under these circumstances, processing the information produced a response that had the quality of a man looking at a problem that was outside the dimensions of anything his experience had equipped him to solve. He said nothing. It was Ira Stokes who broke the silence. Ira, who had arrived at the forge an hour before Warren, who had been sitting in the corner near the secondary bellows with his hat in his hands, who had been quiet in a specific way that was different from Samuel's quiet, in that it contained something compressed and struggling, rather than something measured and still. "She knew," Ira said. He said it to no one in particular. He said it to the space in the middle of the room the way a person says a thing that has been building pressure against the inside of their chest long enough that containment is no longer an option. Samuel looked at him. "What's that?" Edmund Aldrich said from across the room where he sat with his children pulled close. "Eleanor Voss." Ira's voice was low. She knew this was coming. She wasn't wandering out there. She wasn't talking to a dead tree. He stopped. He put his hat back on and then took it off again. "I saw it. I saw what she built. 2 months ago when I was working the northeast line. I went up through the old growth and I found it, the oak, the entrance, the inside." He looked up at Samuel. "It's a shelter. It's a real shelter. It has food and a fire ring and room for, I don't know, a lot of people." The room was quiet. Even the children who had been murmuring in the way of children processing a frightening day went still. "You knew," Samuel said, not as an accusation, as a statement of a fact that was being established for the record. "I knew," Ira said. "I didn't—" He stopped again. The thing he couldn't do was produce an adequate reason for the thing he had done, which was nothing. He had known, and he had not spoken. And the reason, the actual reason, the one he had not allowed himself to name clearly in the 2 months since, was that speaking would have meant standing against the consensus, and standing against the consensus of Coldwater Ridge in the matter of Eleanor Voss would have meant being the person that Cecily Hargrove talked about at the dry goods counter. And Ira Stokes had not wanted to be that person. He understood sitting in the forge in the storm with children quiet in the corner, and the winter provisions buried under the collapsed storage building, exactly what that preference had cost. He understood it in the specific way that you only understand a thing when you can see the full length of the chain between the choice you made and the place you are now standing. "I should have said something," he said. "I should have said something before the council meeting." Samuel looked at him for another moment. Then he looked at Warren. Warren was still standing at the furnace with his hands extended toward the heat. His face, when Samuel looked at it, was the face of a man who was working through the same arithmetic that Ira had just completed, arriving at the same total from a different direction. "We have to find her," Samuel said. He said it simply, without drama in the tone he used when he had reached a conclusion that was not in question. Warren looked up. "In this," Edmund Aldrich said, gesturing toward the forge door through which the sound of the storm was fully audible, even through solid stone. "She went into those woods this morning," Samuel said. "She's there now, in whatever she built." He looked at Warren. "You know she is." Warren did know. He had known it in the place where he stored the things he preferred not to examine since the moment Eleanor had said what she'd said on her porch. And he had categorized it as the speech of a woman whose mind had broken. He knew it now with a different kind of knowing, the kind that comes when the categorization fails, and the thing you stored away surfaces again, recontextualized with full weight. "The food is gone," Samuel continued. "The storage building is gone. Mabel Croft next door says Cornelius Fenwick hasn't opened his shutter since yesterday morning, and there's no smoke from his chimney." He paused. The pause held everything it needed to hold. "We go. We find her. Whatever she's built out there, it's better than what we have here." "She told us not to come," Warren said. It was not a statement of intention. It was something closer to an inventory of what he had done being read back to him by someone who had kept better records. Samuel looked at him with the patience of a man who has been measuring his responses carefully for a long time. "She told us not to," Samuel said. "She didn't say she wouldn't let us in." They went out into the storm. Warren, Samuel, and Ira, with the understanding that this was not a well-considered plan, but the absence of any alternative, which was different. They had no snowshoes. They had wool blankets wrapped around their legs over their boots, which became wet and heavy within the first 100 yards, and which slowed them in a way that was the difference between a difficult journey and a potentially fatal one. They had rope. Samuel had brought a coil from the forge, and they were tied together at intervals of 12 feet, so that if the visibility dropped to 0, they would not lose each other, which was the most likely specific way the situation could get worse. The visibility dropped to near 0 within 200 yards of the town's edge. Warren went down first. He sank to mid-thigh in a drift he hadn't seen until he was in it, and the effort of extracting himself cost him something, not just energy, but the particular expenditure of will that comes from having to physically fight the ground itself. He had been in difficult situations before, but they had been difficult situations in rooms, in conversations, in the domain of social management, where he had spent 40 years becoming skilled. This was different. This was a domain in which all his skills were non-transferable and his body's limitations were precise and specific and not subject to negotiation. He got up. Samuel helped him up, one hand under his arm, without comment. They pushed forward. Ira navigated. He was 22 and had spent more time in this specific forest than anyone in the group, and he moved with a certainty about direction that was not a guarantee, but was better than anything else available. He called adjustments back to Samuel, who relayed them to Warren, and they moved in this chain through the white chaos. Not quickly, not confidently, but continuously, which was the thing that mattered. Warren fell twice more. The second time, he stayed down longer. He lay on his back in the drift and looked up at the sky, which was invisible, which was a flat, white surface that went as far up as he could perceive, with no discernible feature. And he felt something that he was not accustomed to feeling in any of its gradations, which was helplessness. It was not a thing he had believed he would ever feel in this total and physical a form. Helplessness in his experience had always been a temporary state, a problem with a solution on the other side of the right combination of authority and resources. Lying in a drift in a storm that could not see him and did not care about him, with the town's food supply under 10 feet of snow. And a man who lived alone with a bad chimney, who might already be past helping helplessness, felt like its actual definition for the first time. Samuel crouched beside him in the snow. "I can't," Warren said. His voice was quieter than he had intended. The storm took the word. "She did it," Samuel said. "This morning, with the dog." Warren looked at him. "She walked this same ground this morning," Samuel said in the start of this with a canvas bag. "One woman." He extended his hand. "We go on or we stay here. Those are the options." Warren took his hand. He got up. They had been walking for what felt like an hour, though Ira would later estimate it closer to 40 minutes when the sound changed. The forest thickened around them. The timber was older here, the trunks wider, the canopy's remnant structure creating a modest but genuine deflection of the worst of the wind, and it became possible for the first time to hear something other than the storm. It was Ira who stopped first. He turned his head. The rope between him and Samuel went taut. "Do you hear that?" he said. Samuel listened. It was a sound from the forest ahead and to the left. It came twice the second time closer, and it was not the sound of the storm, and it was not the sound of a tree under stress, and it was not any sound that the wilderness in this condition would have produced on its own. It was a bark, deep controlled, carrying a weight of intention that cut through the ambient noise of the storm, the way a voice cuts through a crowd when the voice knows what it is saying. Then, through the swirling curtain of snow, a shape materialized. It was large and dark, and it moved through the drifts with an ease that made their own labored progress look like a different order of activity entirely. It stopped 20 feet ahead of them and looked at them with eyes that reflected even the flat gray light of the storm, with a quality that was hard to characterize precisely, but that none of the three men, separately or together, felt comfortable calling anything other than assessment. Shepard looked at them for 3 seconds. Then he barked once more. Short Directive turned his head. Northwest looked back at them and began to move. He did not run. He moved at exactly the pace that the three men at their best could maintain. He would pull ahead by 15 or 20 feet, then pause and look back, then continue. When Warren fell for the 4th time, and the pause between going down and coming back up was longer than the previous pauses, Shepard came back the full distance and stood at Warren's left side while Samuel helped him up. And Warren, without thinking about it, put his hand on the dog's back, and the dog bore the weight without moving. Then Shepard moved forward again and they followed. Ira said sometime during those last minutes of the walk, almost to himself, "She sent him. She knew we'd come." He said it the way a man says something he has only just understood the words, arriving at the same moment as the understanding behind them. Samuel glanced at him. Warren, a few feet behind, heard it and said nothing, but something shifted in his face, some last resistance to a conclusion he had been approaching for hours finally releasing. Eleanor had heard sounds from the direction of the town the previous evening. Patterns in the wind's behavior that a person who had spent months learning to read this forest would recognize as different from the storm's ordinary conversation. She had not known with certainty, but she had known with enough certainty to do what which was to put her hand on Shepard's neck and say his name in a particular way and point in the direction of the town and tell him with the full weight of their years together what she needed. He had gone without hesitation. She had known when she sent him that she was making a decision that had nothing to do with what the people of Coldwater Ridge had done or failed to do. She was making the decision that Henry had asked her to make on the final page of the notebook, not because they had earned it, because what they had built was for anyone who needed it. She had made the decision before they came. She had made it alone in the hollow, listening to the storm with the fire burning and Shepard already gone into the dark. That was the decision. Everything after was simply its execution. The sentinel oak emerged from the storm, the way certain things emerge from uncertain conditions. Not gradually, not with warning, but suddenly and completely, and with an impact that the human mind processes as wrongness before it processes it as the thing it actually is. Because an oak tree of this size was wrong in the way that the genuinely extraordinary is always wrong when first encountered. It was wrong in the sense that the mind's scale reference for what a tree should be does not accommodate it. It was wrong in the sense that 300 years of uninterrupted growth in a favorable location produces something that exists in a different category from what the word tree normally designates. Ira saw it first and stopped walking. Samuel walked into him from behind. Warren, who had his head down against the wind, ran into Samuel and then looked up. They stood and looked at the tree. Shepard was already at the entrance, the dark opening in the root structure on the leeward side, low and wide, framed by root arches as thick as Samuel's forearm. He turned and looked at the men. Then he disappeared inside. The three men exchanged no words. There was nothing useful to say about what they were looking at or what they were about to do. Warren Caldwell, who had been the first to find his voice in almost every social situation he had participated in for the past 2 decades, ducked his head and followed a dog into the base of a tree. The warmth was the first thing. Not overwhelming warmth, not the disorienting blast of heat that follows extreme cold in enclosed spaces, but the warmth of a thing that had been carefully and deliberately managed. A warmth that had been built at the right rate and sustained at the right level. A warmth that said, someone has been here. Someone has been paying attention. The fire was burning low in the ring of fitted stones exactly as it should be. At this stage of a burn cycle, no taller than necessary, positioned to give the maximum radius of warming heat from the minimum consumption of fuel. The smoke rose into the carved channel in the heartwood above it and disappeared, leaving the interior air clean in a way that seemed improbable given that a fire had been burning there for the better part of a day. The walls around them were ancient wood, the close, dark grain of heartwood, centuries deep. The floor was flat stone covered on the sleeping area with layered rush mats and wool blankets. The shelves along the south wall held sealed clay pots at regular intervals. The firewood cache to the right of the entrance was substantial and dry. And Eleanor was there. She was kneeling beside the fire, adding a piece of split pine, with the attention of someone who is doing a thing they have done enough times to do it without ceremony. She looked up when they came in. Her face in the firelight was calm and unreadable in the way it had been on her porch. Not closed, not hostile, simply the face of a woman who had decided at some point before this moment how this moment was gonna go. She looked at Warren first, then Samuel, then Ira. She looked at each of them the way she had looked at the men on her porch, not through them, but directly at them, a look that registered what it saw without editorializing. Then she looked back at the fire. "Your hands," she said. "Let me see your hands." Warren extended his. They were the color of a winter sunset. Deep red, shading toward white at the fingertips, which was a progression Eleanor recognized and did not like. She took his hands in both of hers and held them at a specific distance from the fire, close enough for the warmth to begin its work, far enough that the rewarming happened at a rate the tissue could tolerate. "Boots off," she said to all three of them. "Everything wet off. Stack it near the entrance, not by the fire." They obeyed her without discussion. Warren Caldwell, who had not obeyed anyone in a long time, unlaced his boots with fingers that were clumsy and cooperative and set them where she had indicated and moved to the fire. Eleanor rewarmed Warren's hands for 4 minutes before releasing them. She checked Samuel's his were better. The hands of a man whose work had made them resilient, and applied a small amount of a herb and tallow salve from a tin on the shelf to the worst portions. She checked Ira's hands and feet. His left foot had the beginnings of the white, waxy quality that meant something was happening beneath the surface that needed management. And she packed it in dry cloth and positioned him so that the foot was elevated slightly and angled toward the fire's warmth. She did all of this in the same manner. She did everything in this hollow with complete attention. Nothing extra, nothing held back. When she was done, she went to the supply shelf and opened 2 of the clay pots and began to prepare food, dried venison and a handful of grain into the small camp pan, with a measured amount of water from the sealed jug. Not a feast, not a gesture. A calculation of what 3 additional people needed and what the supplies could provide. Ira watched her work. He had been watching her since they came in, and the quality of his watching was different from Samuel's and different from Warren's. It contained the specific attention of someone who is looking at the distance between what they knew and what they did, and trying to measure it with enough honesty to eventually forgive themselves. He opened his mouth. He closed it again. He tried again. "Mrs. Voss," he said. Eleanor did not stop what she was doing. "I saw this place," he said. "2 months ago. I knew what you were doing out here." His voice was steady in the way that voices are steady when the person speaking has decided to complete what they are saying regardless of the response. "I didn't tell anyone. I didn't say anything at the council meeting. I thought—" He stopped. "It doesn't matter what I thought." Eleanor did not respond for a moment. She was adjusting the camp pan's position on the fire ring's low shelf. The motion required her attention. Then she said without turning, We'll talk about that when everyone is warm. Not dismissal, not absolution. A deferral that contained within it the information that the conversation would happen, that she had heard him and registered it and intended to address it. But not now, because now there were other priorities, and she did not allow the management of her own feelings to displace the management of immediate needs. It was, Ira would reflect later, the most instructive thing he had ever seen a person do. He had expected anger. He had braced for it. He had constructed in the 40 minutes of walking through the storm a kind of internal petition that was prepared to receive whatever she gave him and call it deserved. And what she had given him instead was a postponement, not for his comfort, but because there was food to prepare and frostbite to manage and a fire to tend, and those things came first. Warren sat against the south wall, his back against the wood, his hands in his lap. The fire's light moved across his face in patterns that changed and changed and changed. He was looking at the clay pots on the shelf. He was looking at the firewood cache. He was looking at the carved channel in the heartwood above the fire ring where the smoke went without drama, without backing into the space, without any of the complications that poorly designed fire systems produced. He was understanding piece by piece, and in the specific vocabulary of a man who had spent 30 years assessing properties and structures and the intentions built into them, what he was looking at. This was not impulse. This was not grief. This was not a mind that had failed to find purchase in the ordinary world and had retreated into a private and meaningless ritual. This was a plan, comprehensive, methodical, sustained over time, executed without support, without acknowledgement, without any of the social reinforcement that makes difficult, sustained effort easier for most people. It was a plan that had included provisions for people who did not know they needed to be included. It was a plan that had reserved space and supplies for people who had that same morning stood on the planner's porch and told her to leave. Warren Caldwell sat against the ancient wood of the Sentinel Oak's inner wall and felt the warmth that Eleanor Voss had built and understood for the first time in his life, what it felt like to have been comprehensively, specifically, and irreversibly wrong about something that mattered. The notebook was on the shelf beside the clay pots. He could see it from where he sat. A plain surveyor's notebook, the kind his own father had used, worn at the spine and dark at the edges from handling. Henry's handwriting he knew without needing to be told. Henry Voss, who had been the most capable man Warren had known, and whose capability Warren had consistently acknowledged while simultaneously understanding it in terms of the categories he used for people capable at that, not capable at this, strong in that way, limited in this one, the categories that made the world manageable by making it smaller than it actually was. He looked at the notebook. He looked at Eleanor, who was tending the camp pan, with the same quality of attention she gave everything complete without excess. He thought about what it meant that Henry Voss had apparently spent 14 years building a refuge in the base of an ancient oak tree in the Wyoming forest, and had told no one except his wife, and that his wife had spent 6 months finishing the work, and had told no one, and that the result of all of that sustained and silent labor was that Warren Caldwell was sitting alive and warming in it right now. He thought about Eleanor's voice on the porch. When the real storm comes, don't come out into the woods looking for me. Outside, the storm pushed against the Sentinel Oak with everything it had. The tree moved in it the way things that are deeply rooted move in force, not rigidly, which breaks. and not freely which fails, but with the specific flex of something that has calculated over centuries exactly how much give is required. The fire burned. Shepherd lay down across the entrance, his nose between his paws, his eyes moving between Eleanor and the door in the rotation of a creature that has assigned itself a duty and intends to fulfill it. Eleanor distributed the food. Warren took the bowl she handed him. Their hands did not touch in the exchange, but they were close, and he looked up at her face at the moment she released the bowl, looking for he was not certain what. Some evidence of what the morning looked like from where she was standing. Her face was what it had been on the porch and what it had been every time he had encountered her in the 6 months of her quiet, maddening, incomprehensible, and now entirely comprehensible project. It was the face of a woman who had somewhere to be and had gone there and was now doing the next necessary thing. He looked back down at the bowl. The venison was warm. The grain had softened in the broth to a consistency that was simple and sustaining. It was not a meal designed for pleasure. It was a meal designed for continuation, for the basic restoration of the body's ability to do what it needed to do next. Warren ate it. The storm outside continued its work. The sentinel oak continued its patience. The fire held its steady measure of warmth, not more than was needed, not less. Later that night, after the 3 men had warmed through, Eleanor took Shepherd and went back toward town. She moved through the storm without the men knowing she was gone, without announcement, with the efficiency of someone who has calculated the risk and determined it is within acceptable range. She brought back Cornelius Fenwick, who was sitting in his chair in the smoky dark of his sealed cabin, with the still inward look of a man whose body has begun to negotiate with unconsciousness. She half carried him the last 100 yards, Shepherd moving ahead to clear the path, and when she brought him through the entrance of the hollow, she lowered him near the fire and worked on him for 20 minutes before the color in his face began its slow return toward the color of a living man. She went back once more before the storm's second night, fully closed in this time with Ira guiding her, and brought the Aldrich family from the forge, Nora carrying the youngest Edmund, carrying the older 2 by turns, the children too exhausted for fear, by then simply clinging. They came into the hollow, and the hollow received them, and by the time the storm reached its second peak, there were 14 people breathing the warm, close air of a space built by 2 people over 15 years for exactly this purpose. And Eleanor Voss moved through her shelter with the quiet authority of a person who has built a thing and knows how it works, and is now simply doing what has always needed to be done. Tending the fire, measuring the food, checking the frostbitten, watching the old man breathe, refusing even now to let the weight of being right replace the more important work of making sure everyone lived. The storm broke on the 3rd morning. It did not break gently. It did not taper or soften or give any of the gradual signals that would have allowed the people inside the sentinel oak to prepare themselves for the transition from one world to another. It simply stopped the way a held breath stops completely. All at once, the absence of sound, arriving as its own kind of sound. A silence so total after 36 hours of unrelenting noise that several people woke from sleep with the panicked certainty that something had gone wrong. Nothing had gone wrong. The storm had exhausted its intentions and moved east into the high plains, and what was left in Coldwater Ridge in the valley and the forest, and along the ridge that gave the town its name, was the aftermath. A landscape that had been altered in the night by a force too large to argue with, and was now simply permanently different. The snow lay in formations that had no precedent in anyone's experience. Drifts 15 feet high against the south faces of buildings. Open corridors where the wind had scoured the ground to frozen earth. The geometry of the town, such as it was, had been replaced by the geometry of what had happened to it. Eleanor was awake before anyone else. She had been awake for the last hour of the storm's duration, lying still in the dark, with her eyes open, listening to the sound change, tracking it. The way Henry had taught her to track weather, not by the loudness, but by the quality, the texture of it. The way the pitch shifted when the pressure behind it began to release. She heard the storm's commitment begin to waver sometime before dawn, and she heard it complete its departure in the gray early light, and she lay there for a few minutes after, in the specific silence of a place that has survived something and is taking stock. 14 people were asleep around her, in the hollow of the sentinel oak. The fire had burned through the night in the managed, careful way she had designed it to burn steady, not lavish, the banked configuration holding its heat through the sleeping hours, and requiring only 2 additions between Eleanor's sleep intervals to maintain the temperature. The air was close with the breath and warmth of 14 people in a space built for that number, which was a different quality of air than the hollow held when she was alone in it. Denser and more human, carrying the specific weight of other people's sleep. She looked at them in the low firelight. The Aldrich children were asleep in a pile at the south wall, under the largest wool blanket Nora Aldrich curved around them with the specific arrangement of a mother who is asleep and present at the same time. Edmund was against the east wall upright, with his head back. His breathing the deep, unconscious breathing of a man who has used everything he had and temporarily surrendered the effort of remaining alert. Cornelius Fenwick lay on his side near the fire. His color returned now to something close to its natural register. His breathing the slow and untroubled breathing of a man whose body has, after the previous evening's alarming negotiations, come back to its ordinary terms. Cecily Hargrove was near the entrance, wrapped in her coat and a blanket, her back against the root arch. She was asleep, but her face was not restful. Even in sleep, her face carried the burden of something that was not finished working itself through. Warren sat against the south wall where he had been sitting most of the night, and Eleanor was not certain he had slept at all. He was holding the notebook, not reading it in the forward direction. He was holding it open to some interior page, and his eyes were moving over the text with the slow returning quality of someone who has read a passage and is reading it again. Not because they did not understand it the first time, but because understanding it the first time was not the same as being finished with it. Eleanor watched him for a moment. Then she got up quietly and went to the fire and added the morning's first log and began to prepare the day's first meal. It was the smell of warm food that woke most of them. The children first, the Aldrich children coming alert in the particular instant way of children who have not yet learned to resist the return to consciousness, sitting up inside the blanket pile, with their hair disordered and their eyes blinking. Then the adults, one by one, each in their own way. Eleanor distributed food in the order of need as she had been doing since the first evening children. First, then Cornelius, then the others. It was not a quantity that anyone would have called generous. It was sufficient, which was a different thing, and in the current circumstances considerably more important. When everyone had eaten and the hollow had the quality of a space in which people are present and thinking rather than sleeping, Samuel Briggs looked at Eleanor and said, "The storm's done." "Yes," Eleanor said. "We should look at the town," he said. Not a suggestion, an accounting of what came next. "Yes," Eleanor said again, "but not yet. Fenwick needs another hour of warm before he goes out." She glanced at Cornelius, who was sitting up with his bowl moving through his food, with the focused attention of a man reacquainting himself with appetite. "And the children need to eat twice before they go into that cold." "I know," Samuel said. "I'm not saying now. I'm saying we should look." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. In all the time she had known Samuel Briggs, she had found him to be the person in Coldwater Ridge whose silences and whose statements occupied the same register, equally measured, equally reliable. He had not spoken at the council meeting, had not voted, and she had not forgotten this. She had not forgotten it as gratitude exactly, because his silence had not saved her, and he had known it would not. But she had registered it as the kind of negative evidence that tells you something true about a person, that there are things he will not put his name to even when the social cost of refusal is real. "An hour," she said. He nodded. Warren looked up from the notebook. He had been looking up from it and looking back down at intervals since Eleanor had noticed him with it. And this was a longer look, the kind that precedes a decision to speak. "That page," he said. He stopped. He looked at the notebook, then back at Eleanor. "Henry wrote my name." Eleanor said nothing. "The last page," Warren said. He wrote that he knew I would find a way to have you leave after he was gone. He wrote that he understood it." He paused. The word "understood" came out with a particular weight, as if the ease with which Henry had apparently understood something that Warren himself had only just arrived at was its own specific form of information. He wasn't angry about it. In the writing, he stopped again clearly, unable to produce a sentence that captured the thing he was reaching for. How did he know? It was not entirely a question. It was the statement of a man discovering that a room he thought he understood has an additional dimension. "Henry knew people," Eleanor said simply. "It was what made him good at what he did. He knew me better than I knew myself, apparently." Warren said this without bitterness. The bitterness had been available to him. There was a version of this conversation in which bitterness was the emotion he landed on. Because bitterness is what is left when pride meets accurate assessment and has nowhere to go. But he did not choose bitterness, or perhaps it did not choose him. And what was left instead was something quieter and less defended. Eleanor looked at him across the fire. "Read the first page," she said. "When you're ready." Cecily Hargrove was awake and had been awake for some time when Eleanor came to sit near her. Eleanor did not sit close. She sat within conversation distance and no closer. And she did not begin the conversation. She waited, which was a thing she was good at. Waiting without pressure, without the specific loaded quality that some silences have when they are being used as instruments. Cecily was looking at her hands in her lap. They were not remarkable hands. They were the hands of a 50-year-old woman who had spent her adult life in domestic management, rather than physical labor. And they showed it softer than Eleanor's, the skin less weathered, the knuckles less pronounced. She was looking at them as if they had become unfamiliar to her, as if she were meeting them for the first time and finding them smaller than expected. I have been, Cecily began, and then stopped, and then started again with the particular false start quality of someone who has rehearsed an approach and found at the moment of execution that the rehearsed version was inadequate. I have said things about you, Eleanor, over many months. I said them without knowing what I was talking about, and She stopped. She looked up. I made it easier for Warren to do what he did. That is the truth of it. I gave it a language that made it feel reasonable. Eleanor was quiet. I want to say I'm sorry, Cecily said, but I am aware that the word is small relative to. She gestured a small, helpless gesture at the hollow around them at the fire, at the clay pots on the shelf, at the 14 people who were alive because of it. Relative to this. Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached out and took the edge of the blanket that had slipped from Cecily's shoulder and settled it back into place. It was a small gesture and a deliberate one, not a dismissal, not a forgiveness dispensed from a height, but the gesture of one woman attending to another in the cold. The gesture of the ordinary decency that exists between people before the categories arrive and complicate it. There's a lot of work coming, Eleanor said. Rebuilding. Winter stores to replace. I'll need people who know how to organize others. She met Cecily's eyes directly. You're good at that. You always have been. Cecily blinked. The thing that crossed her face was not relief. It was something more complicated than relief. The specific complexity of being offered a path forward by the person you have wronged, offered it not as charity, but as a genuine assessment of your usefulness, which was harder to receive and more valuable. Yes, Cecily said. I can do that. Then that's what you'll do, Eleanor said, and turned back to the fire. Ira Stokes waited. He had been waiting since the night before, since Eleanor had said they would talk when everyone was warm. He did not push for it. He sat in his portion of the hollow and was useful where usefulness was available. He had taken 2 of the overnight fire additions, had helped Eleanor with Cornelius when they brought him in, had carried the Aldrich children the last 50 yards when Edmund's strength gave out in the cold. He did these things without announcement, with the focused practicality of someone who has identified the only currency currently available and is spending it as fast as he can. When the hollow had quieted after the morning meal, Eleanor came to where he was sitting near the secondary wood cache and crouched down to his level. He looked at her. He had prepared for this in the way he had prepared for things since childhood, which was to imagine the worst likely outcome and position himself to survive it. The worst likely outcome was that she would tell him what he already knew, that he had had information that could have changed what happened, and that he had chosen his own comfort over using it, and that the consequences of that choice had been carried by people other than himself, which was the definition of a certain kind of moral failure that did not have a clean or easy resolution. He was ready for that. You knew, Eleanor said. Not an accusation, the same register Samuel had used with him in the forge, establishing what was true. Yes, he said. And you said nothing before the council meeting. No, I didn't. Eleanor looked at him steadily. The fire's light moved across her face and settled. Why? She said. It was important to her, he understood, not the answer she already knew, which was fear of social consequence, but the fuller answer, the one that required him to look at it directly instead of sideways. Because saying something would have made me the person everyone was already making you into, he said. And I wasn't willing to be that person. I valued my own standing more than I valued. He stopped. He started again. More than I valued telling the truth about what I saw. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. That's honest, she said. It doesn't fix what I didn't do. No, she said. It doesn't. She looked at him with the clear directness that was simply her way of looking at things, not a performance of intensity, but the default orientation of a person who had decided early that looking away was too expensive. But here's what I know about you, Ira. You walked through that storm last night. You navigated. You didn't have to come. Samuel and Warren would have made the attempt without you. And they might have found it. She paused. But they would have had a harder time. And Cornelius Fenwick would not have made it if you hadn't known the East approach well enough to get us back to him in time. Ira hadn't thought about it in those terms. He had thought about the walk as penance, as the minimum he could do, not as a contribution with a distinct value. The next time you see something that needs to be said, Eleanor said, say it. Be the only person in the room willing to say it if you have to. That is what my husband taught me, and it is the most useful thing I know. She stood up. And Ira, she said. He looked up at her. What you did last night required courage. The fact that earlier you failed to use the same courage does not cancel what you did last night. Both things are true. You'll have to live with both. She held his gaze for a moment. Most people do. She walked back to the fire. Ira sat with his hands between his knees and breathed, and felt the specific quality of a weight that had not been lifted, but had been named, which is different from lifting, but is also not nothing. They went out in the mid-morning when Cornelius had his color fully back, and the children had eaten twice, and the hollow had been restocked and secured against their return. Eleanor went first, ducking through the root arch entrance into a cold that was different from the storm's cold, still severe, still below any temperature that invited lingering but passive, rather than aggressive. The cold of a winter morning rather than the cold of a winter that is actively trying to kill you. She straightened up on the leeward side of the sentinel oak and looked out. The forest was altered. The storm had worked through the old growth section with relative restraint, the oldest trees absorbing the force that the younger trees had not survived. And there were downed trees across the slope, significant ones, their root systems lifted, and the frozen earth around them disturbed in great dark circles. But the sentinel oak stood exactly as it had always stood, which was to say without visible effect, the way very old things stand in the face of the events that disturb everything around them. The others came out behind her one by one, the Aldrich children last blinking in the white brightness of post-storm light, the youngest reaching immediately for shepherd's fur, with the uncomplicated confidence of a 2-year-old who has decided this animal is trustworthy. They stood in a loose group and looked toward where Coldwater Ridge was through the half-mile of timber between them and the valley. We should know what we're walking back to, Samuel said from beside Eleanor. We know what we're walking back to, Eleanor said. We walk back to it anyway. They walked. The town was not entirely gone. This was perhaps surprising given that Eleanor's internal calculations during the storm's second night had placed the worst-case structural losses at around 40% of the primary buildings. The actual losses were somewhat better than that 23 buildings in Coldwater Ridge, of which 6 had suffered complete or near-complete structural failure. 9 had significant damage, and 8 were intact or close to it. The storage building was a total loss. Warren's mercantile, which was a larger and more substantially built structure than most, had lost its east-facing lean-to and sustained serious damage to its roof, but was standing. Samuel's forge was untouched. Its stone roof had done exactly what stone roofs do in conditions that defeat everything else. They walked through the ruins in the white silence of the aftermath. The Aldrich children held their mother's hands and were very quiet. Edmund Aldrich walked ahead and looked at his cabin. The north wall had indeed gone collapsed inward. The interior opened to the sky and did not speak for a long time. Warren walked through what had been the main road of Coldwater Ridge and stopped in front of the collapsed storage building and stood there. The building that had housed the collective provisions of the community, the thing he had spent weeks in the autumn organizing and cataloging and accounting for, the thing he had pointed to as the evidence of what community responsibility looked like, was a collection of broken timber and snow. Samuel stood beside him. "The forge is solid," Samuel said. "We start there." Warren turned to look at him. Then he turned to look at Eleanor, who was standing slightly apart from the group, looking at the valley below the town, at the white expanse of the meadow at the ridgeline, at the pale washed sky of a winter that has finished its work and is now simply present. "Eleanor," Warren said. She turned. He had rehearsed this. He had rehearsed it through the sleepless hours in the hollow, sitting against the old wood with Henry's notebook in his hands, trying to find the version of it that would be adequate. He had not found a version that was adequate. He had decided that inadequacy was not a reason for silence. That silence on this particular subject was a thing he had done enough of. "What I did," he said, "what the council did with my leadership, calling the vote, the way it was framed." He stopped. "I told myself it was about resources, about the community's welfare. I told myself a number of things." He looked at her steadily, the way a man looks when he has decided to stop managing what he is looking at. None of them were the full truth. The full truth was that you were doing something I could not explain, and things I cannot explain make me, he chose the word carefully, uncomfortable. And I have over many years found it easier to remove the thing that makes me uncomfortable than to examine the discomfort. Eleanor said nothing. "Henry was my friend," Warren said. "For 10 years before you came, he was one of the few men in this town I actually respected, and I drove his wife out into a blizzard." He paused. "I'd like to say that I didn't understand what I was doing, but I think I understood more of it than I've allowed myself to admit." Cecily Hargrove, who was standing nearby with her coat pulled close, made a sound. Not a word, just a sound that indicated the particular resonance that honesty has when it arrives unexpectedly from someone from whom you have not expected it. "The land behind my property," Warren said. "The south quarter acre. It's yours. I'll have the papers drawn when we have a room to draw papers in." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "I don't want the land, Warren," she said. Her voice was not unkind. "Keep it. Plant something on it next spring. Henry would have liked that better." Warren did not know what to do with this response. He processed it. He absorbed the texture of it. The refusal without rejection. The redirect that was not a dismissal, but a genuine suggestion. He nodded once slowly, the nod of a man receiving something he does not fully yet know how to hold. "Then what do you need?" he said. "From me, from the town." "I need a 1/4 acre on the east slope for a kitchen garden," Eleanor said. "And I need the community to be willing to learn what Henry's notebook has in it and to build according to it." She looked around at the broken town, at the angled wreckage, and the buried provisions and the structures that had failed, and the few that had not. Angled roofs, deep foundations, a central store dug into the hillside insulated with earth and stone. Buildings designed for the winters that are actually coming, not the winters we wish were coming. Warren looked at the broken storage building. He looked at the 8 structures that were intact and thought about what they had in common: their roof angles, their orientations, their construction methods. Then he looked at the 9 that were damaged and made the same analysis. He was good at assessment. He had always been good at assessment. The problem had never been his ability to assess. The problem had been what he was willing to do with the assessment when it conflicted with a preference he had already formed. "All right," he said. "Show us what Henry wrote." That evening, back inside the Sentinel Oak, because the intact structures were not numerous enough to house everyone, and the ones that were intact needed inspection before anyone slept in them. Eleanor opened the notebook. She read aloud by firelight. She had decided to begin at the beginning, which was what Henry had asked her to do. Read it in order. The front pages first. The first page was dated spring of 1872. The handwriting was younger, more fluid, less deliberate than the handwriting of the later pages, the handwriting of a man in his 30s, with his whole life ahead of him, and the particular confidence of someone who has just found something unexpected and understood immediately what it means. Henry described finding the tree. He described the storm that had driven him to it. He described the night he spent inside the natural hollow, with the first shepherd listening to the wind warm in a place that should not have been warm, and arriving at the understanding that this place was something the world had prepared without being asked to. "I have spent my working life reading what the land says," he had written on the 3rd page of that first entry. "Most of what it says is in the language of the moment, this trail, this weather, this terrain. But occasionally it says something that is not for the moment. It says something that is for later. This tree is for later. I do not know for what exactly or for whom exactly, but I know it is not for now. I will come back. I will learn what it needs, and I will give it what I can. A man owes something to the thing that kept him alive. That is the oldest debt I know, and I intend to pay it." Eleanor paused after she read that passage. The hollow was very quiet. The children were asleep again, arranged in their pile at the south wall. The adults were sitting or lying, listening. Cornelius Fenwick had his eyes closed, but he was not asleep. His breathing was the breathing of someone who is listening with full attention and has closed his eyes to do it better, to remove what the eyes would bring and leave only what the ears could find. Ira Stokes was looking at the fire. Samuel had his arms crossed over his chest, looking at the ceiling of the hollow, at the ancient grain of the heartwood, at the darkness above the fire's light, where the smoke channel was carrying the smoke upward and out through 30 feet of living wood, invisible from the ground above. Warren was looking at his hands. Eleanor continued reading. She read through the practical sections: the fire ring construction, the smoke channel, Design, the store inventory system, the spring location, and the method for accessing it in frozen ground. She read the passage about the winter of 1879, when Henry had nearly stopped when he had come to the oak on a cold March morning, and looked at how much was left to do and understood for the first time that he might not live long enough to see it completed. A thing worth building, he had written, is worth building even if you are not certain you will be there to see it used. The building is not for you. The building was never for you. That is the point of building it. Cecily Hargrove put her hand over her mouth briefly. Then she removed it. Eleanor read on through the years, 1880, 1882, 1884. The slow accumulation of the work. The shelf brackets and the water storage, and the expanded floor and the widened entrance. She read the passages from 1885 and 1886, when the handwriting changed, became more deliberate. The letters formed with the conscious care of a man who knows his hands are not going to be reliable forever, and is compensating. Henry describing the winter signs, he was watching the behavior of the animals, the specific configurations of the cloud formations in September and October. The convergence of indicators he had been tracking since the 1870s. She will finish it. He had written 6 weeks before he died. I have no doubt of this. Eleanor has always understood that a thing begun is a thing owed its completion. She will look at what I have started, and she will see what it needs, and she will provide it. That is who she is. That is who she has always been. I have had the extraordinary good fortune of knowing exactly who that is for 22 years. And I want it on record in this book that she will read that I have never once taken that fortune for granted. Eleanor's voice did not change when she read this passage. She read it the way she read the others, fully, without editorializing. But she paused afterward, a longer pause than the pauses she had taken between sections. And in that pause the fire made its sounds, and the winter made its sounds outside the ancient wood. And nobody said anything. And the pause held everything that needed to be held for as long as it needed to be held. Then she turned to the final page. This was the page Warren had been sitting with through the night. The page with his name. She read it aloud. Warren Caldwell will do what men of his particular nature do when they are frightened by something they cannot categorize. He will find a way to make it stop. I do not say this with anger. I have known Warren for 10 years, and he is not a bad man. He is a man who has confused his comfort with his conscience for so long that he no longer easily distinguishes between them. This is a common condition. I have had it myself. She looked up. Warren's head was bowed. He did not look up. She read on. Whatever he does, do not let it change what you are. Whatever they say about you in town, do not let it alter the fact of what you have built. The fact is not arguable. When the winter comes that I have been watching for, the fact will speak for itself. And when they come to you, they will come, Eleanor, because they will need to let them in. She paused. The fire shifted. Someone in the room exhaled slowly, not because they have earned it. They will not have earned it. Let them in, because what we build is not for the people who believe in it before it is needed. What we build is for the people who need it. That is a larger category. That is the category that matters. And because you are who you are, and because I have had the extraordinary good fortune of knowing exactly who that is, for 22 years, I know that when the time comes, you will not hesitate. I love you, Eleanor. The oak will hold. Eleanor closed the notebook. The silence in the hollow was the silence of a place where something true has just been said in the presence of people who recognize it as true and are taking the time to let it settle into its permanent location. It was Cornelius Fenwick who spoke first. His voice was rough with the aftermath of what the smoke had done to his airways, but it was present and clear. The voice of a man who has come back from somewhere and has something he wants to say before he loses the particular clarity of the return. He was right about the oak, the old man said. Yes, Eleanor said. He was right about the oak. The reconstruction of Coldwater Ridge took the rest of that winter and most of the spring. It was work in the specific sense of a thing that requires everything you have over a sustained period with no guarantee of a fixed endpoint. The kind of work that either makes a community or breaks it with no middle ground. Coldwater Ridge made it through by the margin of several specific decisions, most of which originated with Eleanor and were executed by people who had 2 months earlier believed she had nothing to offer them. She did not lead the effort in any formal sense. She had no title, and she accepted none when they were offered. What she had was the notebook and the knowledge the notebook represented, and the willingness to share both fully with anyone who was willing to work. Samuel Briggs became the primary builder. He understood structure and material in the specific way of a man whose hands had spent decades working iron into shapes that had to hold. And he translated Henry's specifications into timber and stone with a precision that Henry himself would have recognized as kindred. When there were questions, when the specifications met the realities of a particular lot or a particular material shortage, Eleanor read the relevant sections of the notebook, and Samuel worked out the adaptation. They developed over the weeks of this a working relationship that needed very few words. The relationship of two people who respect the same priorities and have complementary skills and have long since stopped wasting time on the parts of communication that those two things make unnecessary. Cecily Hargrove organized the allocation of the surviving food supplies and the controlled release of the emergency stores from the Sentinel Oak, which were brought out in measured quantities as the reconstruction provided spaces to receive them. She did this with the specific competence that Eleanor had identified on the morning after the storm, the talent for social logistics for the management of scarcity in ways that people could accept, rather than resent for keeping track of who needed what and ensuring it moved in the right direction. It was genuine work done well, and Eleanor told her so without ceremony on a Thursday morning in January. And Cecily received it the way she was learning to receive things straight without deflection, and with the particular gravity of a person who is taking something seriously, because they understand it was not required. Warren Caldwell did not lead. He participated. He had never in his adult life participated in something without leading it. And the adjustment was not easy and was not always graceful, but he made it incrementally over the weeks of work. He lifted things. He dug. He went where Samuel directed him and did what was asked. And he did not attach his name to the suggestions he made unless someone specifically requested his view. He was, it turned out, useful in a straightforward physical sense, stronger than his 55 years suggested, willing to endure the cold good with numbers when the numbers needed to serve the work rather than account for it. Ira Stokes worked the forest. He identified the downed trees from the storm that were harvestable timber, which had come down cleanly enough, that their wood was intact and workable, and which had split or checked beyond use. And he worked with Samuel's direction to bring them in. He worked early and late, and his work was good, and at some point in the third week of the reconstruction, he stopped working from penance and started working from something else, something quieter and more durable. Eleanor noticed the shift but did not mark it. It was his to make. The central storehouse was the first communal project. Eleanor had specified it dug into the south-facing slope of the hill at the town's east edge, lined with fitted stone. The roof a berm of compacted earth over a timber and stone structure, with ventilation channels built on the principles Henry had worked out for the smoke management in the Sentinel Oak. It was not beautiful. It was sufficient in the profound sense, the sense in which a thing that does what it is meant to do and will keep doing it reliably is the most important kind of thing there is. The knowledge that it would hold gave the community a quality it had not had before, a quality that is hard to name precisely, but that manifests as the specific steadiness of people who have made honest arrangements with reality, rather than hoping that reality will make arrangements with them. In the late spring, when the snow had retreated from the valley floor, and the first early growth was making itself visible on the south-facing slopes, Samuel Briggs called a town meeting. It was not an official meeting. It was the kind that happens when enough people believe it should, and someone has the practical standing to make it occur. They gathered in the open space in front of the forge, which had become by accumulated consensus rather than formal decision, the town's central meeting ground, because it was the only structure that had come through the storm without a scratch, and because Samuel had never made anyone feel unwelcome in the space in front of it. Eleanor was there. She stood slightly to one side, as was her custom present, available, not positioned at the front. Samuel spoke briefly and without ceremony. He said that the town of Coldwater Ridge had survived a winter that had been survived because of what Henry and Eleanor Voss had built in the forest, and that the town owed the Voss family a debt that could not be fully repaid by anything that could be offered in a morning meeting, but that the debt would be dishonored by not acknowledging it clearly and publicly. He said that in the reconstruction, the area at the center of the rebuilt section of town, the open space where the new communal structures clustered, where the storehouse entrance faced south, and the well was being dug, and the paths between the new buildings were already wearing themselves into the earth, would be known as Voss Square. He said this was not a complicated decision, and that he had not asked anyone's permission, but that he would accept objections if anyone had them. No one had objections. Warren Caldwell stood near the back of the gathering and did not speak. When people began dispersing back to the day's work, he made his way to where Eleanor was standing. He handed her a folded document. "The East Slope quarter acre," he said. "The papers are done. Your name." Eleanor took the document. She opened it and read it with the same attention she gave everything moving through it, completely noting its terms. Then she folded it back along its creases and held it for a moment. "Thank you," she said. Warren nodded. He turned to go. "Warren," Eleanor said. He turned back. She held the document out to him. "Add a codicil," she said. Upon my death, if I have no heirs, the land goes back to the community for common use. Henry would have wanted it that way. Warren looked at her. Something moved through his face that was not simple and was not quick. A slow interior reckoning with the particular quality of a person who does not accumulate, who holds things lightly, who understands that what you build is not yours in any final sense, but belongs in the end to whoever comes after. "I'll have it done," he said. He walked away across the open ground of what was becoming Voss Square, past the men working on the new framing, past the women carrying material to the storehouse entrance, past Ira Stokes, who was on his knees at the edge of the path, fitting stones with the same patience and attention he was learning to bring to most things. Eleanor watched him go. By the first week of June, Coldwater Ridge looked different in ways that were visible and ways that were not. The visible ways were structural. The new buildings had angled roofs, not the gentle pitch that had failed on a dozen structures in December, but the steep angles that Henry's notebook specified. The angles that shed snow rather than accumulating it and collapsing under its weight. The foundations were deeper, reaching below the frost line in the specific manner the notebook described. The walls were built with the timber joint technique Henry had refined over years of observation, more time-consuming than the common method requiring more precise work, but producing structures that moved with the temperature rather than fighting it. The central storehouse sat in the hillside like something that had grown there. Children played on its grass-covered roof in the warm afternoons, and their parents called them down, with the specific combination of alarm and resignation that parents have always used with children who find elevation irresistible. And the children climbed down and went back up again. When the parents looked away, which was the oldest negotiation in the history of human settlement, and would not be resolved in Coldwater Ridge any more than it had been resolved anywhere else. The ways that were not visible were in the fabric of how the people treated each other, how decisions were made, which voices were consulted before conclusions were reached, who was assumed to have something worth hearing before they had proven it in the categories the community had previously used to assign worth. These changes were incomplete and uneven and would remain so because communities change in the same way that individuals change, which is to say, imperfectly and in spirals rather than straight lines, with advances and reversals and long horizontal stretches where nothing seems to be moving but something is. The changes were real. The winter had been the kind of event that is real in ways that last. Eleanor's kitchen garden on the east slope produced its first significant harvest in late summer. The medicinal herbs came first. She dried them in bundles on the lines she had strung between the fence posts, filling the air around the garden with the compressed, serious smell of plants that know what they are for. The vegetables followed through August and September. She preserved what she could and taught the preservation methods to anyone who came to learn. And people came individually and in pairs on weekday mornings and Saturday afternoons with their questions about the soil and the drying and the sealing and the storage. Cecily Hargrove came on a Tuesday in July with her sleeves already rolled and her hair pinned back, and an expression of practical determination that had replaced gradually, and not without difficulty, the expression she had worn for most of the previous year. Eleanor handed her a bundle of seed stock for the herb rows and showed her how the soil wanted to be worked in that particular spot, the specific angle and depth of the tool, the way the ground here preferred to be approached, and they spent the morning on their knees in the dirt together, and talked about things that needed doing. And when Cecily left in the afternoon, she came back the next morning and the morning after that. And eventually, she stopped thinking of it as coming back and started thinking of it as going to the garden, which is what it had become. Cornelius Fenwick, whose lungs had recovered with a completeness that his age had not seemed to promise, built a bench near the east garden fence in late spring and established himself on it on fair afternoons. He read when he read and watched when he watched and dozed when he dozed. And his presence there, the old man on his bench at the edge of the garden, alive and present in the September light, was its own kind of testimony to the winter that had passed and the decisions that had been made in it. On a morning in late September, the first year after the storm, Eleanor walked through the old-growth forest to the sentinel oak. Shepherd moved through the familiar timber with the ease of an animal who has walked the same ground enough times to carry it internally ahead, and then back, and then ahead again, in the particular ranging that was his way of moving through known territory, not guarding exactly, but present the way certain companions are present, as a fact of the landscape rather than a decision being made. The approach was the same as it had always been. The double-trunk birch marking the turn north, the limestone outcrop at the third, the deepening of the timber as the old growth closed in. The path had been walked enough times now, by enough people making the half-mile trip from the valley to see the tree and understand what it was, that it was becoming a path in the visible sense. She could see the wear in the understory, the adjustment the ground made to repeated passage. She was not certain how she felt about this. She thought Henry would have found it appropriate. A thing meant to be reached should be reachable eventually by the people who need it. The sentinel oak stood as it had always stood. She stood in front of it for a while. She had developed this habit over the months since the storm, taking a moment before going inside, acknowledging the thing that was there, giving the oak its full proportion before reducing it to the space she used. 300 years, give or take, in this particular fold of land. Storms beyond counting, seasons beyond counting. The small, persistent drama of human settlement in the valley below, visible on clear days from the ridge, inaudible at this distance, even on the loudest of its occasions. The tree had no opinion about any of this. Eleanor had always appreciated that. She ducked inside. The hollow was as she had left it on her last visit. Fire ring, cold and clean stores at their maintained level. The air holding the specific smell of old wood and earth, and the faint trace of all the fires that had burned here over the winter. She moved through the familiar interior, checking the stores, assessing the firewood cache under both root arches, making the inventory she always made when she came. 14 people for 22 days. The supplies were still sufficient, rebuilt over the months from Eleanor's summer work, and the contributions the town had begun making without being asked, small additions left at the entrance on people's walkthrough. Visits, a bag of dried corn, a wrapped portion of smoked meat, a tin of rendered tallow for the salve. The town's way of participating in the maintenance of a thing that had, without their knowledge, been maintained for them for 15 years. The notebook was on its shelf exactly where it always was. She did not take it down. She looked at it for a moment, at the worn spine and the dark-edged pages, at the shape that Henry's hands had given it over the years of its making and carrying. Then she looked away and finished her inventory. She built a small fire. Not for warmth, the September afternoon was sufficient. For the practice. for the maintenance of the habit that made the thing reliable when it needed to be reliable, because a habit that is only kept when necessary is not a habit but an emergency, and emergencies are not the same as preparation. She watched the fire settle into its pattern, the specific and familiar character of this fire. In this ring, in this hollow that she had learned through more makings than she could count, Shepherd lay down across the entrance, his nose between his paws. The October light of the forest came through the gap above amber, and lo, the light of a season that knows its tenure is ending and is making no particular claim about it. Eleanor sat beside the fire. She thought about Henry fully, without management, in the way she allowed herself in this place and in few others. She thought about the 22 years of him, the particular quality of his silences which had always contained more than other people's words, the way he moved through forest and through rooms, the same economy of motion, in both the same orientation toward the next necessary thing. The things he had understood without being asked to explain them, which had been over those 22 years so many things. She thought about what it meant that his last years had been spent building a shelter for people who did not know it existed and would not have believed him if he had told them. She thought about the specific quality of love that expresses itself not in declaration, but in preparation, in the long, quiet, unwitnessed work of making sure that the people you love will be all right when you are no longer there to ensure it personally. She thought about what it had cost him and what he had calculated it was worth, and how right he had been, and how he had known he was right, and had done it anyway in the particular way of a man who does not need the confirmation to do the work. She thought about the oak's first winter holding all 14 of them, the children and the old man, and the men who had driven her out, and the woman who had given the driving a language, and the young man who had known and said nothing, and the blacksmith who had simply not voted. She thought about the fire she had kept through those nights, the food she had measured out in the careful portions of someone for whom abundance is always a future tense. She thought about the way the ancient wood had held the warmth of all those lives without apparent effort, as if this were simply what it had been waiting to do, as if 300 years of patience had been in preparation for exactly this. She thought about what Henry had written on the last page. The oak will hold. She looked at the fire burning in the ring of fitted stones. She looked at the heartwood walls around her, at the grain of the wood that was centuries laid down and not finished yet. She looked at the darkness above the fire, where the smoke went invisibly into the channel, and up through 30 feet of living wood and out through the hidden gap, and into the open air of the forest dispersing into nothing gone. The oak had held. Outside in the valley below the ridge, Coldwater Ridge was in the middle of becoming something different from what it had been. The visible version of this, the angled roofs and the deep foundations and the storehouse in the hill, was the part people pointed to when they described the changes. But the part that mattered more was not visible or not visible as architecture. It was in the fact that when decisions needed to be made, the people of Coldwater Ridge had learned to pause before they made them, had learned to ask what they might be missing, had learned imperfectly and incompletely, and with regular failures and recoveries, to extend the benefit of the doubt a little further than comfort required. They had learned this the way most important things are learned, which is not from instruction, but from experience of sufficient cost. The children who had slept in the hollow on the worst nights of the storm were playing somewhere in that valley now in the September afternoon light, on the grass roof of the storehouse, or in the new earth gardens, or in the open spaces of a town that had angled its roofs against the future. They did not know yet the full shape of what they had survived and what had saved them. They would be told, as children are told the things that matter in pieces over years imperfectly, the full shape assembling gradually into something they could carry and eventually pass on. They would be told about the storm. They would be told about the tree. They would be told, if they asked the right questions of the right people at the right time, about the woman who had built the shelter, and the man who had started it, and the dog who had gone out into the blizzard and come back with the people who needed to be brought in. Some of them, when they were old enough to make the walk themselves, would come through the old-growth timber to stand in front of the tree and feel the particular quality of disorientation that something of that age and size produces in the human nervous system, the body's instinctive recalibration when it encounters something genuinely outside its ordinary categories. Some of them would duck inside, see the fire ring and the shelves and the flat stone floor and the smoke channel going up into the darkness above, and would understand in the way that only the experience of standing in a space can produce what it meant that someone had made this. And some of them, the ones who were paying the right kind of attention, who had learned or were learning that the most important gestures are often the smallest ones, would leave something at the base of the root arch on their way out. A smooth stone from the creek bed, a wildflower from the meadow at the valley's edge, something small and ordinary placed with care, without audience, without the need for anyone to see it done. The way, in the end, that most of the important things are done. Eleanor sat beside the fire and listened to the September forest through 3 feet of ancient heartwood, and she was, for the first time since the October of the year before, something close to at peace. Not the uncomplicated peace of a person who has gotten what they wanted, because she was not that kind of person, and this was not that kind of story. But the settled peace of a person who has done what they set out to do, and who is now in the right place at the right time, with the work completed, and the fire burning and the dog at the entrance, and the long afternoon ahead. Shepard lifted his head from his paws and looked at her. She looked back at him. Outside, the light continued its slow movement toward evening. The forest made its sounds. The sentinel oak stood in it, the way it had always stood, the way it would stand long after everyone who had ever sheltered in it was gone, patient and enormous and indifferent to the weather and the manner of things that have made their peace with duration. Over so many centuries, that duration has become simply what they are. She had not asked for their love. She had simply refused to let their fear become her own. That had been enough. That had been, in the end, everything.